Welcome to The World We Got This with Esau Williams.
Hello and welcome, and today we're looking at the future of overseas aid, a sector undergoing profound change. Last week, the International Development Committee held an evidence session here at King's College London as part of its inquiry into the future of UK aid. Participants urged a decisive shift toward long-term, locally led development, warning that without reform, the aid programme risks losing both impact and public trust. Well, in the UK, the story began with the cut from 0.7% of gross national income to 0.5 in 2021. And the government now plans to reduce this further to 0.3% by 2027. That's the lowest level in a generation. But today's podcast goes well beyond UK policy. We take a global view, looking at how USAID is evolving under potential political and fiscal pressure. Now, also how multilateral organizations, including the UN and its agencies, are adapting, and what all this means in an era of polycrisis, geopolitical tension, and rising domestic demands on public spending. So to guide us through, we're joined by three leading experts from King's College London. We've got Professor Andy Sumner, a specialist on global poverty and the future of development finance. Welcome, Professor Sumner. And Eduardo Ortiz Suarez, who, in addition to his work on poverty measurement and social policy, is also a senior economic research advisor to the United Nations Development Programme. Welcome, Dr. Ortiz Suarez. Completing the panel is Professor Naomi Hussain from SOAS, an internationally recognized scholar of development politics and accountability, who has researched extensively across Bangladesh, from where she joins us today. Professor Hussain, you seem to have survived the Dhaka traffic, so welcome to the podcast. And together, they will unpack the shifting global aid landscape and explore what the future for development cooperation might look like and what it matters for the world's most vulnerable of communities. So let's get straight into the conversation. So, Professor Andy Sumner, first to you. With all the discussion and all the sort of recalibration going on around the world, can we safely say this means the end of development aid as we know it? Has anything fundamentally changed as a result?
I think we can say that the kind of grant-based or concessionary volume of aid is likely to be lower. There are still 30 or 40 countries that are absolutely dependent on aid, and they're really going to suffer over the next few years. It may well be that what comes to be defined as aid starts to look differently. You know, of course, you've got the kind of Trump shockwave going on, which is much more about national interests. But a lot of European donors are talking about national interests, and actually foreign aid has always really been about soft power rather than sort of purely altruistic thing. So I think aid will remain. It might just look different. And what it actually looks like could beg questions about how developmental it is at all. So there's lots of discussion about mutual interest, but of course you can have mutual interest at 50-50. You can also have mutual interest at 95-5 as a kind of divide. And so if you look to the Trump administration, the bits of their development architecture, or development policy architecture that have survived are largely the bits that are likely to subsidize American companies' investments in incredibly poor countries seeking critical minerals to compete with China. And that's not just me. You can look at the website of some of the agencies, and it's very much, it's on the first page what their role is in terms of competing with China. So something will continue, but it might look quite different to what it's looked like in the past.
Yeah. And Dr. Eduardo Ortiz Suarez, Professor Andy Sumner says that aid is going to look different in the future. It's also probably going to be governed to some extent by national interest. What does this mean for poorer people in the world? Are they going to be pawns of a greater chess game here?
So I think that so what Andy just said is true. It's not the end of aid, but perhaps we are witnessing a significant transformation. So of aid as primarily solidarity driven. So what does that mean for some countries? I mean, It depends on the magnitude of the shock, but there is a risk that especially fragile states with weak absorption capacity to the adjustment will feel the effects. Least developing countries without geopolitical leverage will suffer some of the effects, of course, and social protection systems, right, that need long time horizons will suffer. So with this transformation, I think that there is a tendency to global problems to be increasingly funded, but national systems underfunded. And this, of course, will have important effects in terms of poverty, in terms of social protection, because a lot of these countries that will potentially suffer the effects, their systems, their programs depend on this. So it's hard to say what is the magnitude of the effect on people specifically, but at least will be a continuous delay on the social progress that we have been witnessing in the world.
So impact we will have, that's for sure. Professor Naomi Hussein, I'm just going to ask a very fundamental and basic question. You probably have heard this many times before, but being in the sort of development business as you are, at least from an academic standpoint, can a nation develop without aid? Does it need aid to develop? Because we've been sold that for many years.
I mean, there's lots of different kinds of aid. So yes, a country certainly could develop without aid, depending on on what sorts of relationships it has, what sorts of trade relationships it has as well. But just a quick point on the end of aid or the changing nature of aid, and I think it's really important to historicize aid and to remember that actually this idea that aid should be altruistic and humanitarian in the first instance is actually quite a relatively recent and short-lived notion that really came about with the peace dividend after the Cold War. During the Cold War, there was plenty of aid, and it was not altruistic and it was not humanitarian. It was, if it came from the West, about preventing the Red Peril. So we're not in such a rare historic moment, I think. But in terms of countries developing without aid, Bangladesh, which is where I am, where I've done most of my research over the years, I've called it the aid lab because it was a place where so much experimentation with aid and development policy was, how can I say this, was tried out. And Bangladesh has developed quite rapidly, relatively speaking, and in quite an inclusive way. And many of us believe that aid was really helpful in that respect. What's interesting right now, I think, in Bangladesh is that we're seeing that a country that is no longer aid dependent, has not been aid dependent for a very long time, even though it's now facing the worst effects of climate change, and is one of the biggest countries by population in the world. It's the 8th biggest by population. It's not aid dependent anymore, but the systems, the kind of governance systems Eduardo mentioned, that the national systems are not really geared up to manage these big crises, these big polycrises that you mentioned. And I think we're seeing this in Bangladesh, where kind of governance, politics, people's attitudes, a lot of organizations are kind of accustomed to believing in aid, that aid will come. And I'm not sure they've quite got used to the fact that it's not coming anymore.
And let me stay with you, Professor Hussein, for this question, because is there a danger, just piggybacking on what you've just said, that then countries that are dependent on aid begin to make aid a part of their economic policy? It becomes built into their economic strategy, that dependency then becomes a sort of an economic necessity, if you like.
In heavily aid dependent countries, that always was the case. And there are certain sectors in which, particularly in this more altruistic era, post Cold War aid of the Millennium Development Goals era in particular, the social sectors, the efforts to improve inclusiveness and equity and so on, these were primarily funded in particular by the European, the US, and those sorts of donors. Those sectors will be affected in particular. I think we're already seeing that in some places. withdrawal from health and education, social protection, certainly gender equality, women's rights, that's going to suffer. It's already suffering. But in terms of economic policy, yeah, there are plenty of countries, I think, which already did, for basic needs like food security, depended on aid.
And Professor Andy Sumner, when people think of aid, they think strictly, as you know, of budgets. Are there other purposes of aid? For example, is there a dark underbelly of aid where it's oftentimes linked, I think you said earlier, to things like national interest, the raw realpolitik nature of the world?
If you follow the kind of rules on what aid can be counted that's set by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the baseline is that it's concessional in some way. So it could be grant, it could be low interest loan, or some kind of mix maybe. I think the issue is the spirit of the definition of aid is somehow about economic development or poverty reduction or something like that, has been sort of, I guess, diluted in a way. But even within the rules on what counts as aid, you can include things like refugee costs in the UK. So a very large chunk of UK aid is simply on the costs of the UK incurs for refugees in the UK. And that's not just this government, that's been going on for many years. Other countries count things like scholarships, which you might broadly say was in the spirit of aid. I think over the years, things that might have been labelled aid may not have been aid at all. So there's a kind of question mark there, I think. Actually, if you're trying to find out whether aid leads to rising incomes or poverty reduction, you really need to separate out the aid that's clearly developmental from the aid that's not. And you look at East Asia, you look at sort of aid flows to Indonesia, Thailand, and others. Aid was very important in things like infrastructure building. When you think of sort of the high upfront costs, but that was a world where most of the global South had much lower incomes and much fewer domestic resources. Now, a group of incredibly poor countries, but most of the global South official development assistance probably doesn't matter at all, but they're still paying very high costs for private lending. So there might be a role for some kind of concessional lending, I think, even for those countries that have substantial domestic resources, because the costs of infrastructure, for example, are absolutely enormous, and they span over 20 or 30 years.
And do you think aid itself as a political tool to sell to domestic audiences is becoming very unpopular now? Witness as I said at the start of the podcast, 0.7% cut from gross national income to 0.3% now. It's obviously something that sells across the political spectrum, no?
Yeah, but it's actually 0.18 if you remove the UK costs on refugees. So it's actually even lower than the cuts, or lower than the cuts are perceived to be. I think over the last decade or so, there's been a rise of kind of populist politicians around the world. You can see that in the UK, but across Europe. And what I guess advocates of aid haven't been able to do is present aid as something that is important for relationships between countries, important for historical reasons in terms of climate damage, colonialism, slavery, reparations, perhaps you could have that frame. And so aid's become kind of defined as wasteful, sent to corrupt governments. I think it's, looking at the polling that was at the King's event last week by the University of Birmingham, I was struck by most people would associate wasteful or corruption with UK aid, but they're not against UK aid. So I think that, yes, it's very difficult to sort of defend these things in a period of austerity. Actually, even if you're not driven by solidarity interests, you would be driven by soft power interests. And if you don't make friends with countries, maybe other countries will that you don't like.
And Eduardo Ortiz Juarez, you work obviously within the UN development system. What impact do you think these restructurings within the UN system itself is having on the sort of the future shape of development and of cooperation?
Yeah, this transformation reflects, I would say, a structural funding pressure, not necessarily a short-term crisis management within the system. So I think that just the priorities of the organizations of the multilateral system, and in particular the UN, are changing. So, for instance, we are seeing core funding to UN agencies has been declining in real terms for over a decade, right? And the system has been consolidating some hubs on climate change, on governance, on digital transitions, etc. Very recently, UNDP, my own agency, I mean, I collaborate from time to time with UNDP, had decided to reallocate to some operations from New York to Madrid, some other important operations from New York to Bonn. And what this is telling us is a shift towards thematic specialization, right? So, and also an important signaling, geopolitical signaling, is closer. I mean, we are seeing closer proximity to donors, to regulators, and finance institutions in Europe. So, I would say that this model, this transformation, is prioritizing technical depth, more global coordination, and increasingly policy advisory roles with a trade-off. As I mentioned in the first intervention, we are seeing thinner and thinner country offices, less political economy engagement within some countries, and weaker long-term institutional reform support in fragile contexts. So there is adaptation under constraint. We are moving towards global agendas, but at risk of leaving some fragile countries in need with a weaker intervention of the multilateral system. And I think that the institutions such as the UNDP and other big agencies within the system are. Well, I mean, we could ask what is the bigger proposition of these agencies, right? And I think that we are moving towards more technical credibility, more convenership roles within ministries, etc., but focus more on the bigger agendas, right?
Yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, I think you took the question right out of my mind, but with countries that are doing bilateral agreements with others in terms of helping them using their own aid to help countries directly, it's pretty hard to make a case for the UNDP. I mean, what's the UNDP doing differently? I know you did mention a second ago that, poorer countries that are more vulnerable could be left out. But if, say, a country like the United States deems it in its national interest to send aid to, I don't know, Ecuador instead of Nigeria because it best suits their national interest, what would then be the use of, say, the UNDP to say, oh, no, you can't send aid over there. I think you should send it to Nigeria because they need it more, or they've got more poor people, or people are more at risk?
Yeah, I think that this is a very important point, and it's a reality, right? So, yeah, what is the UN systems value proposition, especially for middle income countries, right? So middle income countries, they don't necessarily they don't rely primarily on aid, right? But there is a huge demand, in my own experience, from middle income countries, both lower income, upper middle income countries, in technical assistance. So I think that the UN system is betting towards that space, increasing technical credibility, setting global agendas for continuous debate, and providing technical expertise, improving on data diagnostics, and setting up standards. For instance, the recent experience, no, the COVID pandemic showed this very clearly. So the UN agencies, in particular UNDP, UNICEF, and another big agenda, supported social protection design, not necessarily in the poorest countries. So I think that for the UN, given this restructuring of aid and development assistance, it's not relying primarily on working on that, but offering technical expertise to middle income country settings in helping them with coordination, with targeting, not just funding. Why? Because middle-income countries are still facing entrenched inequalities, climate vulnerability, the challenges of green transitions, and in some other settings, institutional fragmentation. So, the UN system is seeing that, and this is reflected with the with the reallocations that we are witnessing within the agency, within the organization.
Got it. Thank you very much, Eduardo. Let me just remind our listeners at this point of what they're listening to.
Du hører på ನೀವು ಕೇಳುತ್ತಿರುವುದು
You are listening to The World We Got This podcast.
Okay, and we're back now. We're discussing the future of international aid, and we have Andy Sumner, Eduardo Ortiz Juarez, and Naomi Hussein as our experts on the panel today. And let me come to you, Naomi, in Dhaka, in Bangladesh. Accountability. Oftentimes, the detractors of foreign aid say, you're always sending money to corrupt governments. They wallow the cash, and we taxpayers keep funding their lifestyles. It must stop. And that's probably one of the reasons why you see a great push for governments to cut aid, and there isn't much, in terms of a negative reaction in the developed countries, in the developed world. First of all, how do you set about measuring, first of all, the effectiveness of aid, and secondly, dealing with that big problem of corruption? Projects are a good way of siphoning resources to the wrong pockets.
Both of them, multi-billion dollar questions, of course. And nobody has a definitive answer for sure. But I think one of the things that we're clear about is that the aid community has done a pretty poor job of educating the public about what aid is really about, how it works, what the shortcomings and what the benefits of it are. And one reason for that in the UK, at least, is that ODA, official development assistance, could not be used, was not allowed to be used for educating the public about how aid works and what it's all about. If you look at Sweden, for instance, people have a lot more understanding of where their aid money goes and are much more supportive of it because there is a lot more public education about it. Now, actually, when you look at, in terms of the spend, the British government spend on aid, actually value for money tended to be, when they had a large program, tended to be quite high, particularly for some kinds of programs compared to other sorts of spending. They have these metrics for measuring the value for money that you would get from spending $1 on, food security or something in Malawi compared to on something in the UK, and they have these metrics. And generally speaking, you get a very high return on your aid spend. But it's not at all surprising, actually, that all the political parties, not just right-wing political parties, not just political parties that don't like people in Africa and Asia and Latin America, but all political parties have decided to essentially throw aid under the bus, although, these are times of austerity, perhaps. It's not surprising because, it's an easy way of signaling that you care about your own people more than you care about these foreigners overseas. And that seems to be the much more important political signal to be sending right now. But of course, nobody has actually made the case to the British public or the international aid providing tax-paying public. I think Andy said more or less this as well, which is that there was a very strong, or there was, I should say, a very strong self-interested case for development aid, as well as in particular humanitarian aid and climate change related aid, which is if you do not want lots of immigrants coming to your country in Europe or North America or whatever, then you do want to spend on trying to prevent conflicts, enabling refugees and others to stay where they are in their regions. And that case was never made. NGOs have always insisted on a high moral ground argument for aid. That is where they come from, and that's fine, and that's good. It's bad to instrumentalize aid. It's bad to, make the kinds of calculations on poor people's lives that we would have to do to make those arguments. But nonetheless, it's not very convincing when your own NHS, your own health service is underfunded, your schools are crumbling, that it's really important to spend on poor people far away. The corruption and accountability point as well, that's a really complex matter. And I should say that British aid, UK aid especially, got much better over time at accountability, at following the monies, looking where it goes, how it got spent. But aid money is fungible. So if you're spending, you're financing a program on early childhood development, the money that the government might have been spending on that could be siphoned off for some other reason. So it's not that you could ensure there was no corruption at all. And one other thing about corruption, I think, especially when it comes to the UK, it should be noticed, and this we're talking a lot about in Bangladesh right now, because we had an uprising a year and a half ago that unseated a very corrupt dictator. And one of the things that we found was that the local politicians here had siphoned off billions of dollars every year, off to places like the City of London to be laundered. As we know, the City of London is the money laundering capital of the world. So when you talk about corruption in developing countries, you really do have to turn the lens back onto London and what is happening in London. If London wasn't so easy a place to launder your corrupt goods, your corrupt money, your dirty money, then we wouldn't have quite so many corrupt dictators around to be worrying about.
And Naomi, just very quickly, could a new way sort of rethinking how we do aid involve something like, making aid strictly technical assistance? For example, if, I don't know, a bridge wants to be built in Malawi, that instead of we give the Malawi government the money, we send British engineers to go do the job, pay them for it, and that's the project done.
I think that's already sort of on the cards. I think it seems to be already happening. FCDO here in Bangladesh are starting a number of technical assistance programs. And, in a place like Bangladesh, which is much richer than it was 20 or 30 years ago, that's okay. But in Malawi, perhaps, where the Chinese and the Turks and the Indians, the Russians and the Emiratis are not necessarily crowding on with their finance, it might be less of an easy call in Malawi than it is in Bangladesh. I think, in terms of what aid, I think the soft power point that Andy made really must be stressed. If Europe, if Britain and other countries want to have influence in countries in the global south, want to continue to have good relations in the global south, it's kind of important that they continue to have some engagement. And I think technical assistance alone may not cut it. You really need to know that your friends are there when you have enormous floods because of climate change, or you have a huge refugee influx. You really need that. And frankly, £5 and £10 million technical assistance projects don't send that signal at all.
And Andy, what do you think is the biggest single misconception that the public has about what development cooperation does with countries on a day-to-day basis?
I'm not a polling expert, but I can give you my 2 cents.
We'll take it.
I suspect. Well, you kind of stuck with it. My sense is that there's still a very strong framing that it's somehow about. There's a misconception it's about charity, and I think if you look at countries of the global south, a number of them may have aid flowing in, but they have enormous debt servicing on an annual basis flowing out. So you look at some countries, it's maybe 50 or 60% of ODA is the value of the debt servicing. And then you add to that outflows in terms of transfer pricing, where international companies move money around the world. You add to that enormous royalty payments to use modern technology within global value chains. I mean, it doesn't take long before you have a kind of balance sheet that's very much around the wrong way in terms of very poor countries. I mean, actually, in some ways, it's it's amazing that 20 or 30 developing countries have actually managed to achieve industrialization over the years. And actually, the Cold War was a very important part of that in terms of not only aid from the US and the West, but also preferential access to Western markets, particularly the US. So I think there's this kind of misconception about somehow or other it's about charity. I mean, there's still not really that much broad public debate about reparations for history or climate damage, or I think one of the sort of question marks about the future around sort of climate in particular is the global south simply going to be the place where we get minerals so that the north can go through a transition and the south is just having minerals ripped out of the earth to kind of produce things, mainly in China, because China dominates almost all modern green tech markets, solar panel, etc. And so where's the kind of bigger discussion about you know, countries working together, for a better world? I think that's really got lost. And actually, it may have been there 10, 20 years ago, but I think most countries are now looking inward and actually coming back to what the British public may or may not think about aid. The question mark might be about charity, but also kind of what's in it for us. It's also the point that Naomi picked up on. If you've got austerity or constrained public spending at home, you've got holes in the roof of the school your kids are at, you're kind of sort of thinking, oh, there's other things as well. So there's a real kind of competition. That would be my thoughts.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated on what you mentioned about the Cold War and aid at that time. Paradoxically, could it have been a good time for aid receiving countries in the sense that they knew where the money was going to come from for obviously ideological reasons? They knew the regularity with which it would come and that they were sort of a captive market for these countries that were giving out aid because of geopolitical differences between the West and the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean, if you look into political science, some of the theories are really around the more successful countries had communist neighbors and an internal communist insurgency. So those were the best frameworks for development. I think. I mean, there's still not that many countries that have really gone from being poor or moderately poor to anywhere near the kind of average incomes in rich countries. You can probably pick out less than 20 that have gone through some kind of significant industrialization process. But for much of the Cold War, I mean, that's why I think East Asia was very much a product of the Cold War, in the sense that Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, these were, they were sort of fighting internal communist insurgencies. They had a business military elite that coalesced around that kind of anti-communist national economic development. And of course, they were the biggest factor of all, perhaps on top of the Cold War, was China was in a different place. It wasn't part of the global economy. It hadn't joined the World Trade Organization. It wasn't making 30 to 50% of most of global manufacturing. So countries now, it's much harder. You got to sort of find resources, compete. I mean, I think one thing we don't really talk about very much is this kind of myth that every country is suddenly going to be developed in 50 years' time. If you're lucky, most decades, 2 or 3 countries go through rapid economic change. This is turning into a bit of a rant, so you can you can edit it if you wish. But I know this idea that every country is suddenly going to magically look like I don't know, Kent.
Dubai. Right, but let me bring in Eduardo. I'm just curious also to find out whether we're now shifting this sort of shift from country-based multilateralism when it comes to aid to this more global sort of huge big programming edifice of aid. With that sort of thing possibly going on, are there any losers in that transaction, do you think?
Ooh, yeah. I think that definitely, as I mentioned at the beginning, the less advanced countries with the weaker institutions, countries whose systems depend on multilateral support and technical assistance and funding will suffer the consequences, because what the UN and similar organizations, the World Bank and other, I've been discussing with a lot of colleagues what the transformations entail. So there is a decline of core funding, right, within the organization. So some organizations are competing with some external resources, and this increase reliance on donor-driven and politically framed finance, right? In the long term, this changes the incentive, right? So perhaps some agencies will be, the messages and the actions will tend to align more closely with donor priorities, leaving behind some countries who have no voice in the international discussion, right? There are some documented consequences, softer positions on governance and inequality, reduced willingness to challenge host governments, fragmentations across some agencies. So I would say that the norm setting will become harder when this funding is increasingly depending on compliance with donor narratives, and this is leaving outside the discussion a lot of countries, right, with no voice. So financial dependence, I would say, shapes intellectual independence. This will have some effects on how inequalities are tackled, how poverty is tackled. I wouldn't like to say how it is measured because that would be too much, but who will benefit from what strategies? Yeah, will be the poorest nations. And Andy mentioned something I mean, there are a lot to discuss here, no? This debate on the green transitions, right? So developing countries and some of the poorest nations are now telling me, are raising the voice, no? You want me to embark in a green transition. You are banning my exports to you if I don't comply with this, but you are responsible of the level of pollution that we have now, you, the global north, right? So, and I am rich in natural resources. I don't have incentives, right? Not to develop or not to follow the path that you follow for you to industrialize. So give me something in return. If you don't have the voice to demand that, I think it will be, and you don't have the coordination, right? And it will have an effect, you know, in the long-term development path of the poorer nations and the countries that haven't achieved industrialization and are still finding their way.
Right. And Naomi, if I can ask, I mean, let's talk briefly about the morality when it comes to aid. And I say that thinking firmly about what's now called the financialization of aid. So it's not just aid for its own sake, but it's aid that's backed up with funding for a particular agenda, and also sort of that national interest being sort of the overriding reason why aid is given out. I've heard, for example, of some aid companies linking themselves to pension funds, things of that sort. The poor people obviously need the money, but are you worried that this then becomes a more formalized business plan, a sort of a business structure that countries now will just shamelessly roll out and say, okay, quid pro quo, you do this and here is your aid?
I mean, I think the financialization of aid has been going on for quite a long time and certainly predates this particular phase of official development assistance withdrawal. And there's been a lot of talk for many years now, I'd say it must be at least 10 years now, of innovative financing, which is a way of somehow magicking up pots of money for development finance in the global south, which will somehow yield returns for investors, mostly in the global north. And nobody's ever been very clear about exactly why that would be beneficial for the investors. But the point you make about the morality of aid, I think, is the point that we should really think about a bit more. In the past, when there have been efforts to cut aid or withdraw from international development cooperation, there have been ideas, ethical ideas behind those. There have been ideas that, for instance, we have to help ourselves. There were these things called lifeboat ethics. There was a bunch of different theoretical and ethical efforts to justify the withdrawal of aid. But now we don't see that. I find that very striking, that when you look at what the US government says to justify aid cuts, or the UK government, for that matter, says to justify aid cuts, not much effort is being done to give those an ethical justification. It's just, we're just not doing that anymore. We have our own problems. And I find that, that's to me, in many ways, it leaves me feeling quite cold. A sense that, we don't have mutual responsibilities for each other, that, you're on the other side of the world, a different color, a different race, a different religion, and therefore we don't care. We don't even want to try to justify it. That's for me worrying.
Yeah, and Andy, I mean, Naomi raises that question of the United States, sort of not seemingly caring, but also too, when you look at the US, having withdrawn from dozens of international and UN bodies, what changes for global problem solving are there when you've got such a major power basically voting with its feet?
Well, it can go different ways. I mean, in a way, the departure from the US from I think it was 66 international organizations, the kind of hidden story was the US actually stayed in 134 plus organizations that were on the original list. And of course, they stayed in as a kind of disruptor force. You give one or two examples of this is the rest of the world agreed a carbon levy on maritime tax, and the US intervened and basically threatened at an individual level. It was reported in the Financial Times. They threatened it at an individual level, not at a kind of a bigger level. The European Union negotiators, will withdraw your spouse's visa if you don't kind of get rid of this tax. The kind of level of decline of diplomacy is absolutely incredible. I mean, maybe over the years these things have existed for countries in the global south, but it's quite something when it's sort of countries, it's sort of the EU on the defensive. So on the one hand, it kind of feels that the US is pulling back, but I think there's something different happening, which I think the US is actually staying to disrupt. And what you'll see over the next few years is disruption of anything related to climate or green agendas. That anything related to equity, diversity. These are really the administration's kind of what I call the new Washington dissensus is kind of like based around opposing a certain set of values and ideas. And you talk to people in the US, they absolutely hate NGOs, and you can see even in the US things are starting to sort of really kind of deteriorate. So it's not clear what happens next. But I think in a way it would have been easier if the US had left a lot of international organizations, because then the world could get on with some form of international cooperation. One example where that did happen was in the Finance for Development meeting in Sevilla, where the US wanted to remove any mention of the Sustainable Development Goals and green agendas, and eventually the US simply withdrew from the negotiations. The rest of the world agreed a whole set of initiatives. All of them, nothing that's going to change anything, perhaps, but things that will be nevertheless useful and helpful. Particularly on debt servicing, there was a whole range of initiatives on debt servicing that may not solve the problem, but they certainly make it a little bit easier for countries in the global south to sort of address some of the kind of pressing issues. So I think actually the idea the US is pulling out of these things is a bit misleading, in the sense I think they're staying to wreck.
I see. Interesting. And I'll come back to you shortly on the final round. So let me ask Eduardo, with far fewer resources. I mean, Andy's just talked about, for example, the US, and obviously being in the room to wreck things, but also withdrawing a lot of its support for multinational organizations like the UN. And you've now got different aspects of the UN competing with each other for money, basically, because it does take money to run these programs. What's that going to do for the overall aid atmosphere?
So I think that the main effect that we could expect is a weakening of the norm setting, weakening of predictability, and coordination of collective financing. And when these disruptions occur, as we are witnessing, perhaps, the fear is that standards fragment, the coordination costs tend to rise, because what multilateralism, as we knew it in a perfect world, I mean, a well-functioning multilateralism, what it actually buys is burden sharing, legitimacy, and crisis coordination at scale, such as in instances such as the pandemic or climate shocks. So yeah, we are at the risk of losing this slowly.
Very quickly, 10 seconds to answer. Do you see a world in which aid comes to an end, doesn't happen again because there's just no money to fund it?
No.
Okay, good. That's short enough. Now, my final question to you. In a funny sort of way, with the sort of clamping down on foreign aid, the reduction of the amount of money countries give, especially in the West, to the global South to develop, in a good sort of way, does that force global South countries to find innovative and creative ways to develop and also to not, be dependent, as we said at the start of the program, on aid, having aid as a part of their own economic policy, that this disabuses them of that ability?
It will depend entirely on the politics of development in that country and whether the political elite are committed to and the state has the capacity to deliver development. It certainly will be a kick, and that might kickstart some change in the way politics are organised around development. And that's what I think we're expecting and beginning to see early signs of. But whether that works out for the better or the worse is going to depend a lot on. It's going to vary from country to country, I think.
Okay, and just before we go, let's go through the rounds and begin with you, Naomi, since we're already talking. What do you plan for the next coming weeks on your area of expertise? What are the areas you're going to be looking forward to, or you think we should be paying attention to?
Well, we have elections coming up in Bangladesh in 10 days. We haven't really had democratic elections for a long time. That's going to be interesting for the aid lab to be, looking for a democracy again. And I'm also looking at education reform. I'm looking at why we have expanded schooling so successfully across a lot of the world, actually, and yet the learning outcomes are so poor. This is so important for most developing countries.
And Andy, what area in your expertise are you going to be focusing on and want us to pay attention to over the next coming weeks?
There's a couple of things. The first is the US will release its preliminary data for what it wants to count as official development assistance. And that'll be very interesting because it may well be full of things. We already heard rumors about the kind of things that the administration is trying to include. So that'll give us a sense of exactly what the US's position is on these things. And then, on a broader note, the thing that I think is keeping me going at the moment is thinking much more about mixing social science and science fiction. Because sometimes when you look at the world and then you look at science fiction, then you wonder what's the difference. I think there's a whole area of interest around the use of narratives in social science that's perhaps under explored, and I think it'd be really interesting and something I've been thinking about recently. And with regard to what we're discussing here, there's wildly different futures for global development policy. Even in 2030, you could see some very different kind of outcomes. Using the tools of social science to map out different futures, and maybe looking for some brighter futures out there.
And Eduardo, finally to you, what are you going to be focusing on, and what are you happy to share with us?
Yeah, I will be working on something that Andy is an expert, structural transformation. So I am working with some colleagues, both in academia, but also at the UN, UNDP in particular, who are very interested, and I'm very interested in understanding what are the structural transformations of the 21st century, right? So if the classical models were focused on sectoral relocation, output growth, etc. So we're debating, analyzing what today's transformation should be, how productivity, income, security, sustainability are the new normals.
Oh, sounds very exciting. So I'm going to thank you all, Dr. Eduardo Ortiz Suarez, Professor Andy Sumner, both of King's, and Professor Naomi Hossain of SOAS, joining us all the way from Bangladesh. Thank you all very much indeed. It's been a wonderful hour of good information and learning on my part, and I'm sure on the part of the listeners. So thank you all for your company, and thanks for joining us.